On September 23, 1889, Pittsburgh police raided Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace after neighbors complained of screaming. What they found beneath the floorboards would haunt investigators for decades. 17 human beings chained in darkness, their bodies twisted by years of deliberate torture, still breathing after unimaginable horrors. The autumn of 1889 found Pittsburgh choking on the smoke of 1,000 steel furnaces, the city's skyline pierced by factory smokestacks that belched sulphurous clouds into the Pennsylvania sky. Among the maze of narrow streets in the Strip District, where immigrants crowded into tenements and the smell of sauerkraut mixed with coal dust, stood a peculiar establishment that drew visitors from across the state. Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace occupied a 3-story brick building on Penn Avenue, its facade painted in garish yellows and reds that seemed to glow even in the perpetual twilight of Pittsburgh's industrial haze. Hand-painted signs promised wonders of nature and marvels beyond belief, while smaller notices warned that the contents were not suitable for ladies of delicate constitution. The palace had operated for 7 years, since 1882, drawing crowds who paid 25 cents to gawk at what Madame Zelda claimed were nature's most extraordinary creations. The main floor featured glass cases containing 2-headed snakes preserved in alcohol, what appeared to be mermaid skeletons, and photographs of bearded women and giant men. But the real attraction was the basement theater, where live performers demonstrated their unusual conditions for gasping audiences. Madame Zelda herself was a woman of imposing presence, standing nearly 6 feet tall with steel-grey hair piled high and secured with ornate pins that glinted like weapons in the gaslight. She wore elaborate dresses of deep purple velvet, their high collars ding what appeared to be scars on her neck. Her accent suggested Eastern European origins, though she claimed to have traveled the world collecting her specimens. The neighborhood had always harbored suspicions about the establishment. Residents complained of strange sounds emanating from the building during the night, not the cheers and gasps of entertained crowds, but something more disturbing. Mrs. Kowalski, who lived in the adjacent tenement, reported hearing what sounded like chains dragging across wooden floors. Heinrich Müller, the German baker whose shop faced the palace, spoke of seeing figures moving past basement windows at hours when the establishment was supposedly closed. But in a city where factory accidents mangled workers regularly and poverty drove people to desperate measures, unusual sounds were often ignored. The police had more pressing concerns than investigating the complaints of immigrant neighbors against a business that appeared to operate within the law and drew paying customers from Pittsburgh's more respectable districts. The performers themselves were rarely seen on the streets. Madame Zelda claimed they were shy about their appearances and preferred the privacy of the palace. When pressed by curious reporters, she would explain that her family, as she called them, required special care and attention that kept them occupied during daylight hours. What no one suspected was that beneath their feet lay a chamber of horrors that would shock even a city hardened by industrial brutality. The basement theater of Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace was designed like a miniature opera house, with tiered seating that allowed 50 spectators to view the raised platform where the performances took place. Gaslight fixtures cast flickering shadows that danced across brick walls painted deep crimson, while heavy velvet curtains could be drawn to conceal or reveal the performers as dramatic effect demanded. The regular performers had become familiar to Pittsburgh's audiences over the years. There was Joseph the Human Skeleton. Brennan, whose emaciated frame was exhibited as a medical marvel, though most visitors assumed his condition was natural rather than artificially maintained. Elena, the snake woman, possessed joints so flexible she could contort her body into impossible positions, a talent that Madame Zelda claimed was the result of a rare bone condition. Twin brothers Wilhelm and Otto presented themselves as the Bavarian giants, though their imposing height was accompanied by a strange lethargy that kept them moving slowly and speaking in whispers. Audiences attributed their behavior to the mental effects of their unusual size, unaware that both men were kept in a state of deliberate malnutrition that sapped their strength while maintaining their impressive stature. Perhaps most disturbing was a performer known only as the Wild Child, a young woman whose matted hair and apparent inability to speak were presented as the results of being raised by wolves in the Carpathian Mountains. She would pace her cage-like enclosure, occasionally emitting sounds that seemed more animal than human, while Madame Zelda provided dramatic narration about her rescue from the wilderness. The performances followed a carefully orchestrated routine. Each act lasted approximately 10 minutes, during which the performers would demonstrate their unique characteristics, while Madame Zelda provided commentary that mixed pseudoscientific explanation with theatrical flourish. The lighting was always kept dim, ostensibly to create atmosphere but actually to disguise details that might have revealed the true nature of the conditions being exhibited. Between shows, the performers would disappear behind the velvet curtains, supposedly to rest in comfortable quarters that Madame Zelda described as specially designed for their unique needs. Visitors were never allowed backstage, with Madame Zelda explaining that the performers required privacy to recover from the strain of public exhibition. The audience turnover was constant enough that few individuals attended frequently enough to notice subtle changes in the performers' appearances or behavior. Those who did return regularly attributed any deterioration they observed to the natural progression of the medical conditions they believed they were witnessing. What none of the paying customers realized was that the real horror began the moment the curtains closed and the basement theater emptied of spectators. Behind those heavy velvet drapes lay a nightmare that would have driven even the most morbidly curious visitors screaming into the Pittsburgh night. As autumn deepened into winter in 1889, the residents of Penn Avenue began to notice disturbing patterns that went beyond the usual oddities associated with Madame Zelda's establishment. Mrs. Anna Kowalski, whose bedroom window faced the palace's rear courtyard, reported seeing shadowy figures moving behind basement windows at all hours of the night, long after the last paying customers had departed. The sounds were becoming more frequent and more disturbing. Heinrich Müller, whose bakery required him to begin work before dawn, spoke of hearing what he described as the sound of someone crying, but not like a person, like an animal in terrible pain. The crying would often continue for hours, sometimes punctuated by the metallic scraping sound that residents had learned to associate with the palace. More troubling were the delivery patterns that observant neighbors had begun to document. Food deliveries arrived at the palace 3 times per week, but the quantities seemed insufficient for the number of performers that Madame Zelda claimed to house. Moreover, the deliveries always included large quantities of cheap spoiled vegetables and meat scraps that most establishments would have rejected. Dr. Franz Koller, an Austrian immigrant who ran a small medical practice from his home 2 blocks away, had begun to notice an unusual pattern in his patient visits. Several residents of the area had sought treatment for recurring nightmares, sleep disturbances, and what they described as a persistent feeling of dread that seemed to emanate from the direction of the palace. While Dr. Koller was skeptical of supernatural explanations, he could not ignore the geographical clustering of these psychological symptoms. The most disturbing observation came from young Timothy O'Brien, a 12-year-old boy whose daily route to school took him past the palace. Timothy claimed that on several occasions he had seen faces pressed against the basement windows, faces that did not belong to any of the performers he had seen during sanctioned visits to the establishment. These faces, he insisted, looked hungry and desperate, and they would disappear the moment they realized they were being observed. When Timothy's mother, Margaret O'Brien, confronted Madame Zelda about her son's claims, the proprietress dismissed the boy's account as childhood fantasy. "Children have such vivid imaginations," she said with a smile that Mrs. O'Brien later described as cold enough to freeze summer wine. Perhaps young Timothy would benefit from focusing more on his studies and less on peering into private windows. But the dismissal only intensified the neighbors' suspicions. Several families began keeping their children indoors after dark, and a few residents started carrying lanterns when they had to pass the palace at night. What they didn't know was that their instincts were warning them of a horror more systematic and calculated than their worst nightmares could conceive. On September 15, 1889, Detective Patrick McManus of the Pittsburgh Police Department found an envelope slipped under his office door when he arrived for his morning shift. The envelope bore no return address. and was sealed with red wax that had been pressed with what appeared to be a woman's ring. Inside, written in careful script on expensive paper, was a letter that would change everything. Detective McManus, the letter began, I write to you as one who has witnessed horrors that no Christian soul should endure. The establishment known as Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace conceals beneath its floors a chamber of suffering that would shame the devil himself. 17 human souls are kept in conditions that mock God's mercy. They are chained like animals, fed like swine, and tortured for the entertainment of those who pay to see suffering disguised as spectacle. The letter continued with specific details that suggested intimate knowledge of the palace's operations. It described the location of a hidden entrance behind the building, mentioned the sound of chains during the night hours, and provided a rough sketch of what appeared to be a basement level that extended far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions would suggest. Most disturbing was the letter's description of the performer's true condition. What the public sees is but a pale shadow of the reality. The man they call the human skeleton is starved deliberately to maintain his appearance. The woman who contorts her body has had her bones broken and reset repeatedly to achieve impossible flexibility. The giants are kept weak through poison that maintains their height while sapping their strength. Detective McManus was a 20-year veteran of the Pittsburgh Force, a man who had investigated murders in the steel mills and robberies in the immigrant districts. He was not easily shocked, but something about the letter's tone, its mixture of moral outrage and clinical detail, convinced him that this was not the work of a crank or competitor seeking to damage Madame Zelda's business. The letter concluded with a warning. Time grows short for these poor souls. Each day they remain in captivity brings them closer to death, not through natural causes, but through the systematic destruction of their bodies and spirits. I dare not sign my name, for I fear what Madame Zelda would do to one who betrays her secrets, but I implore you to act before it is too late. McManus read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new details that seemed authentic rather than fabricated. The handwriting belonged to someone educated, possibly a woman, who had access to information that could only come from inside the establishment. But investigating a licensed business on the word of an anonymous letter would require careful planning and ironclad justification. What McManus needed was probable cause that would satisfy both the law and his superiors. Detective Patrick McManus spent 3 days conducting discreet inquiries around Penn Avenue before making any official moves. A stocky man with graying whiskers and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty, McManus understood that rushing into an investigation could alert potential perpetrators and destroy evidence. His first stop was Heinrich Müller's bakery, where he positioned himself as a customer interested in the neighborhood's commercial establishments. Müller, eager to discuss his concerns with someone who might take action, provided a detailed account of the disturbing sounds he had been hearing. "It is not the sound of entertainment, detective," the baker explained in his thick German accent. "It is the sound of pain that goes on too long." Dr. Franz Kohler proved even more valuable as a source of information. The physician had been keeping informal records of his patients' complaints about nightmares and sleep disturbances, noting the correlation with proximity to the palace. More significantly, he had begun to suspect that some of the medical conditions displayed by Madame Zelda's performers were artificially created rather than naturally occurring. The human skeleton condition, Dr. Kohler explained during a private consultation, can be achieved through systematic starvation, but the process would cause tremendous suffering. The flexibility demonstrated by the snake woman could result from repeated breaking and resetting of bones, a practice that would be excruciating beyond imagination. McManus's most crucial discovery came from Thomas O'Malley, a city sanitation worker who had been removing waste from the palace for 2 years. O'Malley reported that the refuse from the establishment contained unusually large amounts of human waste for a business that claimed to house only a dozen performers. Moreover, he had occasionally found items that disturbed him, bloodied rags that appeared to be bandages, broken chains, and scraps of what looked like human hair. "I tried not to think about it, detective," O'Malley admitted. "A man's got to make his living, and questions don't put food on the table. but some nights I can't sleep for wondering what those people are doing in there. The most damning evidence came from city records. McManus discovered that Madame Zelda had applied for permits to construct basement renovations in 1885, claiming she needed additional storage space. However, the actual work performed seemed far more extensive than what the permits described, suggesting the creation of rooms that the city was unaware of. Armed with this circumstantial evidence and the detailed accusations in the anonymous letter, McManus finally had grounds to request a search warrant, but he knew he would have only one chance to catch Madame Zelda off guard. If she suspected official scrutiny, any evidence of wrongdoing would likely disappear along with the victims themselves. The trap was set, but the detective had no idea just how horrifying the truth would prove to be. Judge William Harrison was known throughout Pittsburgh's legal community as a man who required substantial evidence before authorizing searches of private property. When Detective McManus presented his case on the morning of September 22, 1889, Harrison listened with the skeptical attention of someone who had heard countless theories about neighborhood establishments. The anonymous letter alone would not have been sufficient, but McManus had assembled a compelling collection of supporting evidence. The neighbors' testimonies, Dr. Coller's medical observations, the sanitation workers' discoveries, and most importantly, the discrepancies in city records created a pattern that suggested criminal activity beyond simple fraud. "The question before us, Detective," Judge Harrison said, studying the documents spread across his desk, "is whether we have sufficient cause to believe that crimes are being committed that justify the invasion of private property. These performers may simply be unfortunate individuals who have found a way to earn their living through their afflictions." McManus had anticipated this objection. From his coat, he withdrew photographs that Dr. Coller had helped him obtain, images of performers taken from previous newspaper advertisements for the palace, compared with more recent observations. The deterioration in their physical condition over time was undeniable and suggested systematic abuse rather than natural progression of medical conditions. "Your Honor," McManus said carefully, "if these people are being held against their will and subjected to torture for commercial profit, then every day we delay costs them further suffering. If we are wrong, we will have inconvenienced a legitimate business owner and her employees. The risk calculation seems clear." Judge Harrison signed the search warrant at 2:30 p.m. on September 22nd, authorizing a search of all areas of the palace, including any basement or sub-basement levels that might exist. However, he imposed strict conditions. The search must be conducted during daylight hours, with minimal disruption to any legitimate business operations, and with a physician present to assess the condition of anyone found on the premises. McManus assembled his team carefully. In addition to 4 uniformed officers, he recruited Dr. Coller to serve as the medical examiner and Father Michael Ryan from St. Patrick's Cathedral to provide spiritual support for any victims they might discover. He also arranged for 2 representatives from the city's social services department to be present, anticipating the need for immediate care. The plan was simple but required precise timing. The team would arrive at the palace during the afternoon lull between the day and evening shows, when Madame Zelda would likely be in her private quarters and the performers would be confined backstage. This would provide the best opportunity to search the premises thoroughly without interference. As September 23rd dawned grey and cold over Pittsburgh, none of the men preparing for the raid could have imagined the nightmare that awaited them beneath the floorboards of Penn Avenue. At precisely 3:15 p.m. on September 23, 1889, 6 men approached the garish facade of Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace. The autumn air carried the usual mixture of coal smoke and industrial fumes, but Detective McManus noticed an underlying odor that seemed to emanate from the building itself, something organic and unpleasant that he couldn't quite identify. The front door was locked, unusual for an establishment that typically remained open to attract walk-in customers. Officer Timothy Sullivan, the largest man on the team, applied his shoulder to the door twice before the lock gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the narrow street. The main floor of the palace appeared normal, though strangely quiet. Glass cases displayed their usual collection of preserved oddities and promotional mate. Riles for the evening show were arranged on a table near the entrance, but the silence was absolute. No sounds of preparation for the evening performance, No voices from the upper floors where Madame Zelda supposedly maintained her private quarters. Dr. Koller examined several of the preserved specimens while the officers secured the main floor. "Detective," he called softly. "These skeletal remains that are advertised as mermaid bones, they appear to be constructed from human infant skeletons combined with fish bones. The craftsmanship is sophisticated, but the materials are troubling." McManus noted the observation but was more concerned with locating the building's occupants. A search of the upper floors revealed living quarters that appeared to have been hastily abandoned. Madame Zelda's private rooms showed signs of recent departure. Drawers pulled open, clothing scattered, and several pieces of expensive jewelry left behind in what appeared to be a hurried escape. But it was Officer James Murphy who made the discovery that changed everything. While examining the basement theater, Murphy noticed that the floorboards near the back wall sounded different when he walked across them. The hollow sound suggested empty space beneath, and closer inspection revealed what appeared to be a concealed trapdoor. "Detective," Murphy called, his voice tight with tension, "I think you need to see this." The trapdoor was secured with a heavy iron lock, but Officer Sullivan's crowbar made quick work of the mechanism. When the door swung open, it revealed a narrow wooden staircase descending into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light. The smell that rose from the opening was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, rotting food, and something else that Dr. Koller would later identify as the distinctive odor of infected wounds. Father Ryan began to pray in Latin, his voice barely audible above the sound of their own breathing. McManus held his lantern higher and began to descend. And the stairs, completely unprepared for the horror that awaited them in the depths of Madame Zelda's true establishment, the narrow staircase descended 12 feet into a chamber that defied every assumption the investigators had made about the building's layout. The hidden basement extended far beyond the footprint of the structure above, suggesting extensive excavation that had been concealed from city inspectors and neighbors alike. Detective McManus's lantern illuminated brick walls that wept with moisture, creating a surface that reflected their light in sickly patterns. The floor was rough-hewn stone, stained with substances that Dr. Koller would later confirm as blood, excrement, and other bodily fluids that had accumulated over years of human habitation under the worst possible conditions. The chamber was divided into sections by iron bars that created individual cells, each approximately 6 feet by 8 feet. Heavy chains were anchored to the walls and floor, their surfaces worn smooth by constant friction. The metallic scraping sound that neighbors had reported was immediately explained. The chains were just long enough to allow limited movement, but prevented anyone from reaching the cell doors. But it was the occupants of these cells that struck the investigation team with paralyzing horror. 17 human beings in various stages of physical deterioration were chained within the chamber, their conditions ranging from severe malnutrition to injuries that appeared to have been inflicted deliberately over extended periods. The man they had known as the human skeleton was revealed to be a victim of systematic starvation. His emaciation was so severe that his bones were visible beneath skin that had taken on a translucent quality. Chains around his ankles had worn through the flesh, creating wounds that had become infected and were now crawling with maggot. Sir, the snake woman was perhaps the most disturbing sight. Her apparent flexibility had been achieved through the repeated breaking and improper setting of bones throughout her body. Her arms and legs bent at impossible angles, but closer inspection revealed that these deformities caused her constant agony. She could not speak. Her jaw had been broken and had healed incorrectly, but her eyes conveyed a depth of suffering that would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. The twin giants were barely conscious, their massive frames supported by chains that bore most of their weight. Dr. Koller would later determine that they had been poisoned with arsenic doses calculated to maintain their impressive stature while destroying their muscular strength and cognitive function. Most heartbreaking was the young woman known as the Wild Child. Her matted hair concealed scars that suggested deliberate scalp injuries, and her apparent inability to speak resulted from surgical damage to her vocal cords. The animal-like sounds she made during performances were the only noises she could produce. Father Ryan's prayers grew louder as he moved through the chamber, administering last rites to several victims who appeared to be near death. The true scope of Madame Zelda's operation was only beginning to become apparent. As Dr. Collar and Father Ryan worked to provide immediate medical and spiritual care to the 17 victims, Detective McManus began the grim task of trying to establish their identities. Most had been in captivity so long that they bore little resemblance to the people they had once been, but several clues emerged that painted a picture of systematic predation spanning nearly a decade. The man known as the Human Skeleton was able to whisper his name, Patrick Donnelly, a dock worker from Philadelphia who had disappeared in 1883. His family had filed a missing person report, but like thousands of other working-class men in the industrial cities of Pennsylvania, he had simply vanished into the anonymity of urban poverty. Madame Zelda had likely recruited him during a period of unemployment, promising work and shelter. The twins revealed themselves to be Wilhelm and Heinrich Müller, not Bavarian giants at all, but brothers from a farming family in rural Ohio. They had been traveling to Pittsburgh in search of factory work when they had encountered Madame Zelda in 1885. Their natural height, combined with years of careful poisoning, had transformed them into the pitiful figures now barely clinging to life. The snake woman could not speak due to her injuries, but a locket around her neck contained a photograph and the name Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to the Pittsburgh Morrisons from the previous story. She appeared to be in her 30s, though malnutrition and abuse made accurate age assessment difficult. The photograph showed a beautiful young woman with kind eyes, a tragic contrast to the broken creature they found in the basement. Perhaps most disturbing was the identity of the wild child. She was not a feral human raised by wolves, but Mary Catherine O'Sullivan, daughter of an Irish immigrant family from Boston. She had been 16 years old when she disappeared in 1886, according to missing person records that McManus would later locate. Her transformation into a creature that seemed more animal than human represented 3 years of systematic psychological and physical torture designed to destroy her human identity. The remaining victims included 2 elderly men who had been transformed into ancient mysteries, a young woman whose skin had been deliberately scarred to create the appearance of exotic tribal markings, and several individuals whose conditions were so severe that determining their original identities would require weeks of investigation. What became clear was that Madame Zelda had not simply been exploiting people with natural deformities or medical conditions. She had been systematically kidnapping healthy individuals and transforming them through torture, starvation, and deliberate injury into the curiosities that drew paying customers to her establishment. The scope of the crime was unprecedented in Pittsburgh's history, but the full horror was still emerging as more victims were discovered in additional chambers beneath the building. Officer Murphy's continued exploration of the basement revealed that the nightmare extended far beyond the initial chamber. Behind a false wall concealed by hanging curtains, a second staircase descended even deeper into the earth, leading to what could only be described as Madame Zelda's workshop of human modification. This lower level contained 4 additional rooms, each designed for specific aspects of her horrific trade. The first room served as a surgical theater, equipped with medical instruments that had been stolen or purchased from legitimate sources, but were now stained with the evidence of unspeakable procedures. Leather restraints attached to a wooden table showed wear patterns that suggested years of use, while nearby shelves held bottles containing organs and body parts preserved in alcohol. Dr. Collar examined the surgical implements with professional horror. "These tools have been used to perform operations without anesthesia," he reported to McManus. "The bone saws show evidence of use on living patients, and these forceps have been employed to deliberately break and reset bones multiple times. This is not medicine. This is systematic torture disguised as medical procedure." The second room contained what appeared to be a primitive laboratory where Madame Zelda had experimented with various methods of physical modification. Bottles of chemicals lined wooden shelves, including arsenic compounds, acids for creating skin scarification, and substances that McManus couldn't identify but which Dr. Collar suspected were used to induce specific types of physical deterioration. Most chilling was a Lethe, a bound journal that documented Madame Zelda's methods with clinical precision. The entries, written in several languages including English, German, and what appeared to be Hungarian, detailed techniques for breaking human bones without causing death, methods for inducing controlled starvation, and procedures for permanently damaging vocal cords and other body parts. The third room served as a prison for new acquisitions, individuals who had been recently kidnapped but not yet transformed into suitable performers. 3 people were found in this room: a young man who had been reported missing from Allegheny City 2 weeks earlier, a middle-aged woman whose disappearance from the Strip District had not yet been reported, and an elderly vagrant whose absence from the streets would likely never be noticed. The fourth and final room contained the most disturbing evidence of all, a collection of photographs documenting the transformation of victims over time. Before and after images showed healthy individuals being systematically destroyed and rebuilt according to Madame Zelda's vision of profitable entertainment. The photographs also revealed victims who were not found in the basement chambers, suggesting that Madame Zelda's operation had resulted in deaths that had been concealed from authorities. The missing individuals represented a murder count that would likely never be fully established. As the investigation team worked to document the evidence, one question dominated their thoughts. How had Madame Zelda managed to escape, and where was she now? The mystery of Madame Zelda's disappearance began to unravel as Detective McManus and his team conducted a systematic search of her abandoned quarters. The evidence suggested that her escape had been carefully planned and executed with the precision of someone who had always anticipated the possibility of discovery. In Madame Zelda's private study, McManus discovered a sophisticated early warning system that had allowed her to monitor both the street outside and the activities of her neighbors. Mirrors positioned at strategic angles provided a clear view of anyone approaching the building, while a speaking tube connected to the basement chambers allowed her to communicate with Confederates who helped maintain her operation. The speaking tube led to a small room that had served as living quarters for 2 assistants who had aided Madame Zelda in her horrific work. These men, identified from personal belongings as Ivan Kozlov and Dmitry Volkov, appeared to be recent immigrants from Eastern Europe who spoke little English and had likely been unaware of the full scope of the operation when they first became involved. More disturbing was the discovery of a detailed escape plan written in Zelda's handwriting and dated just 3 days before the raid. The document outlined multiple routes out of Pittsburgh, including connections to similar operations in other cities throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio. It was clear that Madame Zelda was part of a larger network of individuals engaged in what could only be described as human trafficking for entertainment purposes. Financial records hidden behind a false panel revealed the true scope of the operation's profitability. Madame Zelda had been earning approximately $200 per week from admission fees, a substantial sum in 1889 that placed her among Pittsburgh's more prosperous business owners. More troubling were payment records showing regular transfers to individuals in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Cleveland, suggesting that her operation was connected to similar establishments throughout the region. The escape itself had been executed during the early morning hours of September 22nd, just hours after McManus had obtained the search warrant. This timing was too coincidental to be accidental, leading the detective to suspect that someone in the legal system had warned Madame Zelda of the impending raid. A careful examination of the evidence suggested that Zelda had fled westward, possibly toward Cleveland or Chicago, where the network of similar operations could provide shelter and assistance. Her assistants, Kozlov and Volkov, appeared to have scattered in different directions, taking with them whatever portable wealth they could carry. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of letters indicating that Madame Zelda had been planning to relocate her entire operation to a larger facility outside of Pittsburgh, where she could expand her collection of human curiosities and operate with even less risk of discovery. The hunt for the escaped proprietress was about to expand beyond Pittsburgh's city limits. As Detective McManus delved deeper into Madame Zelda's correspondence and financial records, a horrifying picture emerged of an organized network that stretched across multiple states. The Curiosity Palace was not an isolated operation, but rather one node in a system that traded in human suffering on an industrial scale. Letters discovered in a hidden compartment revealed regular correspondence with at least 6 similar establishments operating under different names throughout the Northeast. Professor Moreau's Cabinet of Wonders in Baltimore, the Anatomical Museum in Philadelphia, and Barnum's rejected specimens in Cleveland all appeared to be connected to Madame Zelda's operation through a complex web of shared resources and victim exchanges. The correspondence revealed a sophisticated system for acquiring new specimens. The network operated talent scouts who haunted train stations, immigrant processing centers, and areas where transient populations gathered. They specifically targeted individuals who would not be immediately missed: recent immigrants, orphans, vagrants, and those fleeing personal or legal troubles. Most chilling was a letter from someone identified only as the Doctor in Philadelphia, discussing techniques for modifying human subjects to create more profitable exhibitions. The letter included detailed instructions for surgical procedures, chemical treatments, and psychological manipulation methods that could transform healthy individuals into the grotesque figures that drew paying audiences. "My dear Zelda," one letter read, "the new acid treatment for skin modification has proven most successful. The scarring patterns can be controlled precisely to create the appearance of exotic tribal markings, and the subjects remain viable for exhibition for months afterward. I am sending you a supply via the usual channels." Financial records showed that the network operated on a profit-sharing basis, with a percentage of each establishment's earnings being forwarded to a central organization that provided startup funds, training, and logistical support for new operations. The scale of the enterprise suggested that dozens of individuals were involved in various capacities, from the operators like Madame Zelda to the scouts who procured victims to the corrupt officials who provided protection from law enforcement. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that the network had been expanding rapidly in recent years. Letters discussed plans for new facilities in Chicago, St. Louis, and even San Francisco, suggesting that the operators viewed the American public's appetite for sensational entertainment as an unlimited market for their product. The correspondence also revealed that Madame Zelda held a special position within the network. Her facility in Pittsburgh was referenced as a training ground where new techniques were developed and perfected before being distributed to other operations. This explained the sophisticated nature of the torture methods discovered in the basement laboratory. Detective McManus realized that arresting Madame Zelda would be only the beginning of a much larger investigation that could potentially expose dozens of similar operations and hundreds of victims across multiple states. Dr. Franz Koller had witnessed suffering in his years treating industrial accident victims in Pittsburgh's mills and mines, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic destruction of human bodies that he encountered in Madame Zelda's basement chambers. His medical examination of the 17 victims revealed horrors that would reshape his understanding of human cruelty. Patrick Donnelly, the human skeleton, weighed less than 80 pounds despite being nearly 6 feet tall. His malnutrition was so severe that his body had begun consuming its own muscle tissue and organs to survive. The chains around his ankles had worn through skin and flesh to expose bone, creating wounds that showed signs of deliberate infection. Dr. Koller's examination revealed that Donnelly's starvation had been carefully calculated. He was kept just above the threshold of death to maintain his skeletal appearance while preserving his life for continued exhibition. The examination of Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, the Snake Woman, revealed bone breaks and resets that demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy combined with complete disregard for human suffering. Her spine had been deliberately curved through a series of controlled breaks, while her limbs had been systematically fractured and allowed to heal improperly to create the impossible flexibility that audiences found so fascinating. The precision of the damage suggested that someone with medical training had planned and executed the modifications. The Muller brothers' condition proved to be the result of calculated arsenic poisoning administered in doses that maintained their impressive height while destroying their muscular development and cognitive function. Their weakened state was not a side effect of their natural size, but rather the intended result of years of systematic toxicity designed to make them docile and manageable while preserving their value as exhibits. Mary Catherine O'Sullivan, the wild child, had undergone the most extensive psychological destruction. Her vocal cord damage was surgical rather than accidental, and her scalp bore scars from deliberate injuries that had been repeatedly reopened to maintain their fresh appearance. Her behavior, which audiences interpreted as feral, was actually the result of deliberate psychological torture designed to break her human identity and create a creature that seemed more animal than person. The other victims showed similar patterns of calculated modification. An elderly man had been subjected to chemical treatments that had accelerated his aging and created the appearance of ancient, mysterious origins. A young woman's skin had been systematically scarred using acid to create patterns that suggested exotic tribal origins. Dr. Collar's professional conclusion was that someone with extensive medical knowledge had designed and implemented these modifications using techniques that maximized suffering while minimizing the risk of death. The perpetrator understood human anatomy well enough to inflict precise damage that would heal in ways that created the desired visual effects for public exhibition. The victim's survival was itself evidence of the operator's sophisticated understanding of human physiology and the limits of what the body could endure. As the rescued victims received medical care and began to regain their strength, Detective McManus worked carefully to gather their testimonies about their experiences in Madame Zelda's chambers. The process was delicate. Many of the survivors had been so psychologically damaged that communication was difficult, and several were still too weak to provide detailed accounts. Patrick Donnelly, despite his severe physical condition, proved to be the most articulate witness. Speaking in whispers that McManus had to strain to hear, Donnelly described how he had been lured to Pittsburgh by a woman who promised him steady work at good wages. She seemed kind at first, he recalled. Said she ran a boarding house for working men and that I could have a room and meals in exchange for helping with odd jobs around the building. The transition from guest to prisoner had been gradual and calculated. Donnelly described how his food portions had been slowly reduced while his workload increased. When he complained or tried to leave, he was told that he owed money for his room and board and would have to work off the debt. By the time he realized the true nature of his situation, he was too weak to escape and found himself chained in the basement chamber. Wilhelm Müller, one of the Bavarian giants, provided similar testimony about the gradual process of victimization. He and his brother had responded to a newspaper advertisement for men of exceptional size who could earn good money in entertainment work. Madame Zelda had met them at the train station, provided comfortable lodging, and spent several weeks gaining their trust before revealing the true nature of their employment. She told us we were special, Wilhelm said through tears that Dr. Collar had to wipe away because the victim's hands were still too weak to lift. She said people would pay money just to see how tall we were, and that we could make more in a month than we could make farming for a year. We thought we were lucky. The process of transformation had been presented as necessary preparation for their performances. The brothers were told that their size made them naturally weak and that the medicine they were given would strengthen them for their demanding work. Only gradually did they realize that the medicine was actually poison that was destroying their health while maintaining their impressive stature. Mary Catherine O'Sullivan could not speak due to her injuries, but she was able to write short notes that described similar patterns of deception and gradual imprisonment. Her abduction had been more direct. She had been taken from a Boston street while walking home from her job at a textile mill, but her subsequent treatment followed the same pattern of systematic destruction designed to create a profitable exhibit. Each testimony revealed new aspects of Madame Zelda's sophisticated methods of victim acquisition and control. News of the discovery at Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace spread through Pittsburgh with the speed of a steel mill fire, creating a public reaction that ranged from horror to morbid fascination. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette published a front-page story on September 25, 1889, with the headline, "Chamber of Horrors Discovered, 17 Victims Rescued from Torture Palace," accompanied by illustrations that attempted to convey the basement's layout without depicting the full extent of the victims' suffering. The public's initial response was overwhelming sympathy for the survivors combined with demands for justice. Church congregations throughout the city took up collections to fund medical care for the victims, while women's charitable organizations organized donations of clothing and personal items. The German Lutheran Church, led by Pastor Heinrich Stromberg, established a special fund specifically to assist the Müller brothers, whose story had particularly touched the large German immigrant community. However, as details of the operation became public knowledge, a more disturbing reaction began to emerge. Several newspaper editors published opinion pieces questioning how so many citizens had visited the establishment over the years without recognizing the signs of abuse. The Pittsburgh Tribune ran an editorial titled "The Complicity of Curiosity," which argued that everyone who had paid admission to see the performers bore some responsibility for their suffering. More troubling was the revelation that some visitors had suspected the truth but had chosen to ignore their suspics. Irons in favor of the entertainment value. Thomas Whitmore, a businessman who had attended the palace multiple times, admitted in an interview that he had noticed the performers seemed unusually lethargic and had wondered about their living conditions. "But I told myself it wasn't my business," he confessed. "I paid my quota and enjoyed the show like everyone else." The story attracted national attention when it was picked up by newspapers in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. The Associated Press distributed a shortened version of the story that reached newspapers across the country, making Madame Zelda's operation a symbol of urban moral decay and the dangers of unregulated entertainment. Religious leaders used the story as evidence of society's moral decline, while reform advocates pointed to it as proof that government oversight of commercial establishments was inadequate. The case became a rallying point for the growing movement to regulate public entertainment and protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Perhaps most disturbing was the emergence of a small but vocal group of defenders who argued that the performers had been willing participants who had benefited from steady food and shelter in exchange for their exhibitions. These voices were quickly drowned out by public outrage, but their existence suggested that some members of society were prepared to justify almost any level of human suffering if it could be presented as voluntary economic participation. The case was reshaping Pittsburgh's understanding of entertainment exploitation and moral responsibility. Detective McManus coordinated with law enforcement agencies across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Maryland to track down Madame Zelda and her confederates. Telegraph messages flashed between police departments as descriptions of the fugitives were distributed to train stations, hotels, and boarding houses throughout the region. The investigation revealed that Madame Zelda was actually Zdzislava Horakova, a 42-year-old woman from Bohemia who had immigrated to the United States in 1878. Immigration records showed that she had initially settled in New York City, where she had worked briefly as a seamstress before disappearing from official documentation. Her transformation into the proprietress of a curiosity palace suggested a level of criminal sophistication that had developed over years of careful planning. A breakthrough came when police in Cleveland reported discovering similar operations in their city. Detective Samuel Morrison, no relation to the Pittsburgh Morrisons from earlier stories, had been investigating complaints about Professor Moreau's Cabinet of Wonders when news of the Pittsburgh raid reached his department. A coordinated raid on the Cleveland facility yielded evidence that directly connected it to Horakova's operation, including correspondence that revealed her current whereabouts. The letters indicated that Horakova had fled to Chicago, where she was attempting to establish a new operation under the name Madame Celestine's Museum of Natural Wonders. Chicago police, alerted by telegraph from Pittsburgh, began surveillance of locations that matched the operational pattern established by the network. Meanwhile, Pittsburgh authorities continued to uncover evidence of the scope of Horakova's local connections. Bank records revealed that she had maintained accounts under multiple names and had transferred substantial funds to associates in other cities just days before her escape. The sophistication of her financial arrangements suggested that she had been planning her exit strategy for months, possibly years. More disturbing was the discovery that several prominent Pittsburgh citizens had been aware of the true nature of Horakova's operation, but had been silenced through blackmail. A cache of documents hidden in her office revealed compromising information about city officials, business leaders, and clergy who had visited the establishment and witnessed conditions that should have prompted immediate intervention. Judge William Harrison, who had authorized the original search warrant, found his name on a list of individuals who had been photographed during visits to the palace. The photographs taken without the subject's knowledge showed these respected members of society viewing the basement exhibitions with expressions that ranged from fascination to obvious enjoyment of the victim's suffering. The blackmail operation explained how Horokova had been able to operate for so long without official interference. She had systematically compromised individuals who might have posed a threat to her operation, creating a network of unwilling protectors who had been forced to ignore evidence of criminal activity to protect their own reputations. The manhunt was no longer just about catching a fugitive, it was about exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Pittsburgh society. Detective Patrick McManus arrived in Chicago on October 2, 1889, carrying with him photographs of Zdzislava Horokova and her known associates, along with detailed descriptions of the methods used to operate her human trafficking network. The Chicago Police Department, led by Inspector James Murphy, another Murphy but no relation to McManus's Officer Murphy, had been conducting surveillance of suspected locations based on the intelligence provided by the Pittsburgh investigation. Chicago in 1889 was a city rebuilding from the Great Fire of 1871, its rapid growth creating perfect conditions for criminal enterprises that could blend into the chaos of construction and immigration. The city's numerous entertainment districts provided cover for establishments like the one Horokova was attempting to establish, while its position as a railroad hub made it an ideal center for the network's expansions. And into the Western Territories. Inspector Murphy's team had identified 3 locations that matched the operational pattern established by Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace. The first was a warehouse district building that had been rented under the name Celestine Morgenstern just days after Horokova's escape from Pittsburgh. The second was a partially constructed entertainment hall near the stockyards, where workers had reported strange construction requests that included unusual basement modifications. The third was an established museum of oddities that had recently changed ownership and begun advertising new exhibitions. The surveillance of these locations revealed patterns that confirmed Horokova's presence in the city. Delivery schedules, visitor patterns, and construction activities all matched the methods she had employed in Pittsburgh. More significantly, several individuals matching the descriptions of her escaped associates had been observed entering and leaving the warehouse district building during hours when legitimate businesses would be closed. The Chicago investigation also revealed the scope of the network's western expansion plans. Intercepted letters discussed potential operations in St. Louis, Denver, and San Francisco, suggesting that Horokova and her associates viewed the American frontier as an unlimited market for their brand of human exploitation. The correspondence indicated that Western cities with their less developed law enforcement and more transient populations would provide ideal conditions for expanding the network's activities. Most disturbing was evidence that the Chicago operation was already acquiring new victims. Police had received reports of missing persons that matched the profile of individuals targeted by the network. Recent immigrants, orphans, and transients whose disappearances would not immediately trigger intensive investigations. The pattern suggested that Horokova had not fled to Chicago to hide, but rather to establish a new and potentially larger opera, Tian. Detective McManus realized that they were racing against time. Each day that Horokova remained free allowed her to expand her criminal enterprise and acquire new victims who would suffer the same systematic torture and exploitation that had been discovered in Pittsburgh. The Chicago raid was scheduled for October 5th, but Horokova's network had proven capable of sophisticated intelligence gathering and advanced warning systems. At dawn on October 5, 1889, a coordinated force of Chicago and Pittsburgh law enforcement officers surrounded 3 locations simultaneously, hoping to prevent Horokova from escaping once again. Detective McManus joined Inspector Murphy's team in the assault on the warehouse district building, while separate squads targeted the entertainment hall construction site and the established museum. The warehouse district building initially appeared abandoned, its windows dark and its loading dock empty of the usual commercial activity. However, the officers' approach triggered a response that confirmed their target was present. Smoke began rising from several points within the building, suggesting that occupants were destroying evidence in preparation for another escape. Officer Timothy Sullivan, whose experience with the Pittsburgh raid had made him expert in identifying concealed entrances, discovered that the building's basement had been extensively modified with hidden passages and reinforced chambers. The construction work was more sophisticated than what had been found in Pittsburgh, suggesting that Horokova had learned from her previous operation and was implementing improved methods of concealment and control. The first victims were discovered in a section of basement that had been designed to prevent their cries from reaching the street level. 12 individuals, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly adults, were found in various stages of the transformation process that would have prepared them for public exhibition. Several showed evidence of recent surgical modifications, while others appeared to have been recently acquired and were still in relatively good physical condition. The rescue operation was complicated by Horokova's use of the building's industrial equipment to create obstacles for the raiding party. Steam pipes had been deliberately ruptured to fill corridors with scalding vapor, while chemical storage areas had been set ablaze to create toxic smoke that forced officers to retreat and regroup with protective equipment. Most troubling was the discovery of a workshop that exceeded even the sophistication of the Pittsburgh laboratory. Medical equipment that appeared to have been stolen from legitimate hospitals was arranged in an operating theater designed to perform multiple simultaneous procedures. The precision and scale of the setup suggested that Horokova had been planning to significantly expand her human modification operations. However, when the officers finally secured the building and extinguished the fires, they discovered that once again, Horokova had managed to escape. Evidence suggested that she and her core associates had fled through an underground tunnel that connected the warehouse to the Chicago River, where boats could have carried them to safety before the raid began. The other two locations yielded similar results: victims in various stages of modification, evidence of systematic torture and exploitation, but no sign of the primary perpetrators. The network's leaders had once again demonstrated their ability to anticipate law enforcement action and execute sophisticated escape plans. But this time, they had left behind something more valuable than evidence: living witnesses who could provide detailed information about the network's future plans. The 12 victims rescued from Horokova's Chicago operation provided Detective McManus with intelligence that transformed the investigation from a manhunt into a comprehensive assault on an organized criminal enterprise. Unlike the Pittsburgh survivors, several of the Chicago victims had been imprisoned for only weeks rather than years, leaving their memories and cognitive abilities largely intact. Margaret Sullivan, a 19-year-old seamstress who had been abducted from a Chicago train station 3 weeks earlier, provided the most detailed account of the network's operational methods. She described being approached by a well-dressed woman who offered her employment as a domestic servant for a wealthy family. The woman, who identified herself as Mrs. Richardson, explained that the position offered excellent wages, comfortable lodging, and the opportunity to travel. She seemed like a proper lady, Sullivan recalled during her interview with McManus. She spoke educated English and wore expensive clothes. She showed me a letter of recommendation from a family in New York and promised that I would be treated well. I had no reason to suspect anything unusual. The deception had continued for several days after Sullivan accepted the position. She was housed in comfortable quarters above the warehouse and given light domestic duties while being gradually isolated from outside contact. Only when she attempted to leave the building did she discover that she was actually a prisoner being prepared for a far more sinister fate. James Morrison, a 16-year-old orphan, again no relation to previous Morrisons in these stories, had been recruited through a different method. He had been living on Chicago's streets when approached by a man who offered him work as an assistant in what was described as a traveling scientific expedition. The promise of steady meals and indoor shelter had been irresistible to a young man facing the prospect of winter without adequate housing. The most disturbing testimony came from Dr. Heinrich Weber, a 34-year-old physician who had been kidnapped specifically for his medical knowledge. Weber had been forced to participate in the modification procedures under threat of becoming a victim himself. His detailed account of the surgical methods employed by the network provided crucial evidence of the systematic nature of the torture and the level of medical sophistication involved. They had equipment that rivaled the best hospitals, Weber testified, but it was being used for purposes that violated everything I had sworn to uphold as a physician. They forced me to perform procedures that had no purpose other than to create profitable deformities for public exhibition. Weber's testimony also revealed that the network was actively recruiting medical professionals either through kidnapping or through financial incentives offered to doctors willing to abandon ethical practice. This explained the sophistication of the modification techniques that had been observed in both Pittsburgh and Chicago. The intelligence gathered from the Chicago victims would prove crucial in tracking down the network's remaining operations and preventing further expansion of the criminal enterprise. Following the Chicago raid, Detective McManus partnered with federal postal inspectors to trace the financial networks that had enabled Horikova's operation to expand across state lines. The investigation revealed a sophisticated money laundering system that utilized multiple banks, false identities, and a network of legitimate businesses to obscure the criminal origins of the enterprise's profits. Bank records in Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, and Baltimore showed a pattern of regular transfers between accounts held under various names, all of which could be traced back to individuals associated with the Curiosity Palace network. The amounts involved were substantial. The combined operations had generated over $50,000 in profits over 7 years, a fortune that exceeded the annual income of most legitimate businesses. The financial investigation also revealed the Main Network's method of expansion. Startup funds for new operations were provided through a central organization that appeared to be based in New York City. This parent organization not only provided capital but also arranged for the acquisition of equipment, the recruitment of personnel, and the establishment of protective relationships with corrupt officials in target cities. Most disturbing was the discovery that the network had been systematically investing its profits in legitimate businesses throughout the Northeast. Hotel chains, restaurant operations, and even some manufacturing concerns had received funding from the Curiosity Palace network, creating a web of legitimate commerce that helped launder the proceeds of human trafficking and torture. The postal inspector's investigation revealed that the network communicated through a sophisticated code system that disguised their correspondence as legitimate business communications. Orders for new specimens were written as requests for exotic merchandise, while reports on victim conditions were formatted as inventory updates. The code was sophisticated enough that it had passed through postal inspection without detection for years. Perhaps most valuable was the discovery of a master ledger hidden in a Chicago bank safe deposit box. The ledger, maintained in Horikova's own handwriting, contained detailed financial records for all network operations, including planned expansions that had not yet been implemented. The document revealed that the network was planning to establish operations in at least 8 additional cities, with the ultimate goal of creating a continent-spanning enterprise. The ledger also contained the names and addresses of corrupted officials in multiple cities who had been receiving regular payments in exchange for protection from law enforcement interference. The list included police officers, judges, city inspectors, and even clergy who had been compromised through either financial incentives or blackmail. Armed with this financial intelligence, federal authorities were able to freeze accounts, seize assets, and begin the process of dismantling the network's financial infrastructure. More importantly, the information provided actionable intelligence about the locations and methods of operations that had not yet been discovered by law enforcement. The hunt for Horikova and her associates was about to expand into a coordinated federal investigation. The master ledger's intelligence led investigators to Baltimore, where the network's largest and most sophisticated operation was discovered in an abandoned shipyard warehouse near the Inner Harbor. Federal marshals, working in coordination with local police and Detective McManus, surrounded the facility on October 20, 1889, prepared for the possibility that Horikova had once again anticipated their approach. Unlike the previous raids, this time the law enforcement teams had advance intelligence about the building's layout, security systems, and escape routes. The ledger had contained detailed architectural drawings showing the location of hidden chambers, secret passages, and the underground tunnel system that Horikova used to transport victims without detection. The warehouse contained the network's most extensive operation yet discovered. 23 victims were found in various stages of the modification process, while evidence suggested that dozens of others had been held there over the years. The facility included multiple surgical theaters, a laboratory for developing new torture techniques, and living quarters for the network's core leadership. But most significantly, this time Horakova was present when the raid commenced. The 42-year-old woman who had terrorized victims across multiple states was found attempting to destroy evidence in a basement office that served as the network's operational headquarters. When cornered by Detective McMahon and federal marshals, she made no attempt to flee or resist arrest. "You have no idea what you are destroying," Horakova told McManus as handcuffs were placed on her wrists. "These people are nothing, discarded waste that society ignores. I gave them purpose, made them valuable. I created entertainment that brought joy to thousands of paying customers." Her words revealed a mindset that viewed human beings as raw material for commercial exploitation, with no recognition of the suffering she had caused or the lives she had destroyed. Even when confronted with the evidence of systematic torture, Horakova maintained that her operation provided a valuable service to both the victims and the public. The Baltimore facility also yielded the network's remaining leadership. Ivan Kozlov and Dmitry Volkov, Horakova's assistants from the Pittsburgh operation, were captured along with 3 other individuals who had been managing various aspects of the criminal enterprise. Dr. Heinrich Weber, the physician who had been forced to participate in the Chicago operation, identified 2 of the captured men as individuals who had supervised the most brutal modification procedures. Perhaps most importantly, the Baltimore raid prevented the network's planned expansion into the Western Territories. Documents found in Horakova's office revealed detailed plans for establishing operations in Denver, San Francisco, and Seattle, suggesting that dozens of additional victims would have suffered if the network had not been dismantled. The final confrontation had ended the immediate threat, but the investigation's revelations would continue to shock the nation and reshape public understanding of commercial entertainment and human exploitation. The trial of Zdislava Horakova and her associates began on January 15, 1890 in Pittsburgh's federal courthouse, drawing national attention and establishing legal precedents for prosecuting organized criminal enterprises that operated across state lines. The proceedings, presided over by Judge William Morrison, the same judge who had authorized the original search warrant, would become known as one of the most significant criminal trials of the 19th century. The prosecution, led by federal prosecutor James Hamilton, presented evidence that documented systematic human trafficking, torture, and murder spanning 7 years and multiple states. The survivor testimonies were particularly powerful, as victims described the methodical process by which healthy individuals were transformed into grotesque exhibits for public entertainment. Patrick Donnelly, who had recovered enough strength to testify, provided devastating testimony about the systematic starvation that had reduced him to less than 80 pounds. His appearance in court, still gaunt but no longer skeletal, demonstrated the calculated nature of his treatment and the medical knowledge required to maintain victims at the threshold of death without allowing them to expire. Dr. Heinrich Weber, the physician who had been forced to participate in the network's operations, testified about the surgical procedures he had been compelled to perform. His detailed description of the modification techniques provided expert medical testimony that established the deliberate and systematic nature of the torture. Weber's testimony also revealed the network's recruitment of medical professionals and the sophisticated equipment used in their operations. The defense, led by attorney Charles Morrison, no relation to the judge or previous story characters, attempted to argue that the victims had been willing participants who had benefited from steady food and shelter. This strategy backfired spectacularly when the prosecution presented photographs documenting the victims' physical deterioration over time, clearly showing the systematic destruction of their health and appearance. Horakova herself proved to be an unrepentant defendant who showed no remorse for her actions. When given the opportunity to address the court, she delivered a speech that further incriminated her by revealing the full scope of her criminal philosophy. "I provided entertainment to thousands of satisfied customers," she declared. "I gave purpose to individuals who would otherwise have died in poverty and obscurity. The weak exist to serve the strong. This is the natural order of things. If society chooses to be horrified by the methods I employed, it is only because they lack the courage to acknowledge their own desires for spectacle and sensation." Her words were met with audible gasps from the packed courtroom and would be quoted in newspapers throughout the country as evidence of the moral corruption that could develop when human beings were viewed as commercial commodities. The trial lasted 6 weeks and resulted in convictions on all charges for Horokova and her primary associates. On March 3, 1890, Judge William Morrison delivered sentences that would establish important legal precedents for prosecuting organized criminal enterprises. Zdzislava Horokova received the maximum penalty allowed under federal law, death by hanging, making her one of the first women in American history to be sentenced to death for operating a criminal organization across state lines. Her primary associates, Ivan Kozlov and Dmitry Volkov, received life sentences without possibility of parole. The 3 additional network leaders captured in Baltimore received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, depending on their level of involvement in the torture and modification procedures. The sentences reflected not only the severity of the crimes but also the court's recognition that the network represented a new form of organized criminal enterprise that required harsh penalties to deter similar operations. Judge Morrison's sentencing statement acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the case and its implications for future law enforcement efforts. The defendants operated a systematic program of human trafficking and torture that spanned multiple states and victimized dozens of innocent people, Morrison declared. Their crimes represent not merely individual acts of cruelty but a calculated assault on the fundamental principles of human dignity and individual liberty that define our society. The trial's conclusion was followed by a comprehensive investigation of the corrupted officials who had enabled the network's operations. The master ledger found in Chicago provided evidence of systematic bribery and blackmail involving police officers, city inspectors, and judicial officials in 5 states. The resulting prosecutions led to the removal of over 30 public officials and established new standards for oversight of public entertainment enterprises. Perhaps most significantly, the case prompted legislative changes that strengthened federal authority to investigate and prosecute crimes that crossed state boundaries. The Horokova case became a precedent for federal intervention in organized criminal enterprises and helped establish the legal framework that would later be used to combat other forms of interstate criminal activity. The victims received varying degrees of compensation through the seizure and liquidation of the network's assets. While no amount of money could repair the physical and psychological damage they had suffered, the financial settlements provided resources for ongoing medical care and helped several survivors establish new lives away from the cities where they had been victimized. The surviving performers from the Pittsburgh operation faced the challenge of rebuilding their identities after years of systematic dehumanization. Some, like Patrick Donnelly, eventually recovered enough to return to productive lives, though they carried permanent physical and emotional scars from their experiences. Others, particularly those who had suffered the most extensive psychological damage, required long-term institutional care that would continue for the remainder of their lives. The network's destruction had ended an immediate threat, but its legacy would continue to influence American law enforcement and entertainment regulation for decades to come. The exposure of Zdzislava Horokova's network triggered a wave of reform that fundamentally changed how American society regulated public entertainment and protected vulnerable populations. The case became a catalyst for legislation, institutional changes, and social movements that would have lasting impact on the treatment of individuals with disabilities and unusual physical conditions. The Pennsylvania state legislature passed the Entertainment Safety Act of 1890, requiring all public exhibition facilities to submit to regular inspections by medical professionals and social workers. The law also established strict standards for the treatment of performers, including requirements for adequate nutrition, medical care, and living conditions. Similar legislation was quickly adopted by neighboring states, creating a regional network of protection that made it much more difficult for similar operations to establish themselves. At the federal level, Congress passed the Interstate Human Trafficking Prevention Act of 1891, which gave federal law enforcement agencies expanded authority to investigate and prosecute crimes involving the transportation of victims across state lines. The law also established federal oversight of businesses that employed individuals with unusual physical conditions, requiring documentation of their voluntary participation and regular welfare checks. The medical community responded with the establishment of professional ethics standards that explicitly prohibited participation in procedures designed to artificially create or exacerbate physical deformities for commercial purposes. The American Medical Association adopted a formal code of conduct that made such participation grounds for expulsion from the profession and criminal prosecution. Religious organizations throughout the Northeast established support services for individuals who had been exploited by entertainment enterprises. The Catholic Church created the Society of St. Francis for the Protection of the Afflicted, which provided shelter, medical care, and vocational training for people with disabilities who might otherwise be vulnerable to exploitation. Perhaps most significantly, the case contributed to changing public attitudes toward the commercial exhibition of human differences. The revelation that audiences had unknowingly been viewing the results of systematic torture led many Americans to question the morality of freak show entertainment entirely. While such exhibitions did not disappear immediately, they faced increasing social disapproval and legal regulation that would eventually lead to their decline. The case also influenced the development of social work as a profession. The need for trained individuals who could identify and assist victims of exploitation led to the establishment of the first formal social work training programs in several American cities. These programs produced professionals who would play crucial roles in protecting vulnerable populations from various forms of abuse and exploitation. Detective Patrick McManus received national recognition for his role in exposing and dismantling the network. He was promoted to chief inspector and spent the remainder of his career developing investigative techniques for identifying and prosecuting organized criminal enterprises. His methods became standard practice for law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. The victims' courage in testifying against their tormentors became a symbol of resilience and the power of truth to overcome even the most systematic oppression. 25 years after the raids that exposed Zdzislawa Horakowa's network of human exploitation, the case continued to influence American society in ways both seen and hidden. By 1914, the entertainment landscape had been fundamentally transformed by the regulations and cultural changes that followed the revelations of systematic torture disguised as commercial exhibition. The survivors who had testified in the trial became inadvertent symbols of resilience and the human capacity to overcome unimaginable adversity. Patrick Donnelly, who had recovered from his systematic starvation, became a prominent advocate for labor rights and worker protection. His speeches at union rallies often referenced his experience in Horakowa's basement chambers as evidence of what could happen when human beings were viewed as expendable commodities. Mary Catherine O'Sullivan, despite never fully recovering her ability to speak, learned to communicate through writing and became an influential correspondent for several women's rights publications. Her articles, published under the pseudonym Silent Witness, provided first-hand accounts of exploitation that helped fuel the growing movement for women's protection and social reform. The Muller brothers, whose recovery from arsenic poisoning was never complete, established a small farm in rural Pennsylvania, where they provided sanctuary for other individuals who had been victimized by various forms of commercial exploitation. Their property became an informal refuge that served dozens of people over the years, demonstrating how victims could transform their experiences into sources of help for others. Dr. Heinrich Weber, the physician who had been forced to participate in the network's operations, dedicated the remainder of his career to providing free medical care to individuals who could not afford treatment. His work in Pittsburgh's immigrant communities was driven by his determination to use his medical knowledge for healing rather than the harm he had been compelled to inflict during his captivity. The case's influence on law enforcement continued to expand as Detective McManus's investigative techniques were adopted by police departments throughout the country. His methods for identifying and dismantling organized criminal enterprises became standard training for federal agents and contributed to the development of what would eventually become the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Perhaps most importantly, the case established the principle that systematic human exploitation for commercial profit was not simply a collection of individual crimes, but rather a form of organized criminal activity that required coordinated law enforcement response. This precedent would prove crucial in later efforts to combat other forms of human trafficking and organized crime. The basement chambers of Madame Zelda's Curiosity Palace were eventually filled with concrete and the building demolished, but the site became a memorial to the victims and a reminder of the vigilance required to protect society's most vulnerable members. The memorial's inscription read simply, "In memory of those who suffered in darkness and in honor of those who brought them into light." The legacy of horror had become a foundation for hope and institutional change that protected future generations from similar exploitation. Could you have walked past that building for years without noticing the suffering hidden beneath your feet? Tell me in the comments. What signs would you have looked for, and would you have had the courage to investigate?